It's the spirit, because this we are here as a celebration because tremendous progress has occurred in the field, and you all should take credit for that, because without you, we wouldn't be here today with not just imaging-based diagnostics, but emerging blood tests that can help to diagnose the pathologies, as well as at least 2 therapies that have been shown to be effective therapies for the treatment of persons with very mild to mild stage dementia caused by Alzheimer's disease. The drugs donanemab and the drugs lecanemab, and this is tremendous progress. Many of those studies were done here. Some of the early work to develop the biomarkers that were used in the donanemab study was done here, and in part led by Christopher Clark, the first founding director of the Penn Memory Center. So all of you should feel like this is a celebration of the work that you did, because being in research is work. Over 200 people RSVP'd to be here, such that we actually have an emergency overflow room in the event that everybody shows up. That's a record of RSVPs. So again, thank you. I'd like the study coordinators who are in the room to stand up. Please make yourselves sort of visible to the audience, because the study coordinators here will be helping to move folks around. They're sort of in the fringes there. You may recognize some of them, and this is your chance to come up and say hi and chat with them and talk with them. Here's our, I want to offer some specific thank yous. I've already first thanked you all, our research participants. Without you, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have made the progress we made. I want to thank the family members. We call them study partners. In the clinical practice, we call them caregivers. We have a real quirky term called knowledgeable informants. This is a disease of, we actually call them that, yeah. Can't make this stuff up. We rely, we recognize that this is a disease of you, the plural you of us. I can say that not just professionally, but personally now in my own family. And so we want to thank the family members for the work you do, and it is work, in providing care and in participating in the research studies. We want to thank our community partners who have been magnificent in our work to better develop and conduct science that serves the needs of the Philadelphia region. Our study ambassadors, some of you go even up over and above the call of the work of being in research, and our ambassadors going out into the community and talking about what it is like to be in our studies, giving talks about what it is like to have an MRI, what it is like to have a PET scan, why did I join the study. We really appreciate the work of our study ambassadors. And if any of you who are in the studies would like to be an ambassador out speaking about the experience, we're part of an advisory board that we're going to be forming about being what it's like to be a research participant. Please let us know, let one of the study coordinators know I'm interested in being an ambassador. I would be interested in participating in a research participant advisory board. So this is your chance today to let us know that, but you'll hear more about those opportunities. We'd like to thank our advisory board, leaders from various community organizations, the Alzheimer's Association, the Philadelphia Corporation on Aging, Enon Tabernacle Church, Alpha Phi Alpha, for their participation, giving us candid and frank advice every quarter. And finally, I'd like to thank our fundraising committee. Many of you are in the room here. It's made up of patients and family members who have been diligently working to put together an event that I'll tell you about in a minute. Lots of thank yous. Today, after I finally get off the stage, you'll hear from Sanjeev Vaishnavi, Dr. Vaishnavi, talking about the progress that we've made and the promise that we have going forward, developing pharmacologic therapeutics. Next, Felicia Greenfield will talk about the progress we've made and the promise going forward, developing behavioral and social and environmental services and supports and care. And then my friend and colleague, David Wolk, co-director of the Memory Center, director of our Alzheimer's Center, will deliver an overview keynote about the progress that's been made in research and the promise ahead. And after that, we'll have our notoriously famous Q&A panel for you all to ask us the frank and candid questions. And again, along the way, tables will be tapped to head out and gather your lunch and come back in. And we'll keep the noise level there such that we can continue even outside to hear the talks, so you won't miss anything as you get your plate filled. I'd like you all to take note. The work of the communications team led by Terry Casey over there. I'd like everyone to just give Terry Casey an applause. Because we're here, and you know you're found out about here because of the team that he leads of communications. We're thoroughly integrated into the legitimate social media. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and also subscribe if you haven't. I suspect just about everyone here is subscribed to our weekly Insight News magazine. Stay tuned because we are entering the world of podcasting. We hope by the end of this calendar year to premiere the pilot episodes of the Age of Aging podcast. And we think that that will, in the coming years, be one of our key venues for disseminating our messages. So stay tuned. Some particular communications events that I think many people will be interested in is, a few months ago, David Wolk and I did What's Lecanemab and What's Next. Coming up in August of this year, plan on attending virtually What's Donanemab and What's Next. I say August, not to interrupt your vacations, but in late July, the full data of the Donanemab study will be presented, including we expect a paper in the peer-reviewed literature. And so we're going to hold off on presenting on that until we see that paper and read it. And so plan for an August webinar where we present about what's donanemab and what's next. That, along with the lecanemab webinar, are all on www.pennmemorycenter.org, our center's webpage, where you can go and view it at your leisure, along with other information about these two new drugs that are just on the cusp, we think, of full FDA approval. It has been a very difficult 3 or 4 years. Let's just simply acknowledge that, 3 years. I say 3 or 4 because time got bent and twisted. And I think in particular for our community, they were particularly difficult years and months. The separation necessitated by social distancing was for many utterly devastating. And the stories we heard from our families of the fractured minds that occurred because of that for people in hospital and residential care facilities, patients and families where their care systems were disrupted was devastating, and there's no question lives were lost. In addition, of course, Alzheimer's remains a disease which over time and other causes of dementia which can ultimately lead to death. And so I'd like us to join in just a moment of silence as a community to remember what we've come through and the people that we've lost. And I'd like us to, though, think in one word, which is to have hope. So join us, we hope, on June 14th for a celebration of hope. This was an event put together by the work of our fundraising committee. June 14th, 6 p.m. at the Pop-Up Garden on South Street. It's our fundraising event, as well as just a celebration of hope. You can learn more about it on our webpage. On your agenda on the backside is information about the celebration of hope. One of its intentions is to raise funding, and I just want to point out very plainly, about $1.5 million of our annual budget is utterly dependent on philanthropy. And so this is an event that for us is extremely important. And as I say, information about that is on your table on the flip side of your agenda. So, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Next up is my friend and colleague at the Memory Center, Dr. Sanjeev Vaishnavi, and did you want to?
No, I just.
Nope. And as I say, we're going to begin from the outside in to bring the tables out to gather lunch. So let's listen and eat, or eat and listen. All right.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. That's a great response. I'm not used to that. I'm used to people just staying very quiet, but this is a wonderful group. Welcome, everyone, to the Thank You Luncheon here at the Penn Memory Center. I am Sanjeev Vaishnavi. I am one of the clinicians in the Memory Center, the director of clinical research, and the clinical director for the Division of Cognitive Neurology here at the University of Pennsylvania. So my task here is to give an overview about what we're doing in the clinical research space. I think they gave me about 15 minutes, so I don't think I'll be able to cover absolutely everything. That's not possible because there's a lot that's going on in our field. There's a lot that we're doing here at the Memory Center. So I do want to cover a few things, and then we'll have time for questions against our notorious Q&A later today. So always disclosures, I do lead many clinical trials here at the Memory Center, and I have done some consulting work with some companies. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to start a little bit about research in the field of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, and kind of give some perspective in terms of where we are now, how we got here, and kind of the steps in between. I'll talk a little bit, as Jason mentioned, about the role of biomarkers, because that's been a recent advance in the past really 10 to 20 years. We've gone from not being able to diagnose diseases using pathology to actually being able to specifically identify individuals even before they have symptoms. We're going to talk a little bit about kind of how we got there. We'll talk briefly about the advances in therapies. I believe Dr. Wolk will talk more about that a little bit later. And then we'll cover some of the trials just to highlight some of what we're doing here and some additional opportunities. And last but not least, to thank you, because without you, we would not be able to make any advances in our field. We would be much farther away from treatment and really effective treatment for Alzheimer's disease. And with your help, we will get there. So I want to start off kind of back in the day. I don't know if there's anyone here who was born in 1906. I think probably not. But the disease process that we're talking about here, Alzheimer's disease, really the timeline starts in the early 1900s. So back in 1906, Alois Alzheimer's described the brain pathology, which was later named as Alzheimer's dementia. In 1910, the Alzheimer's disease was actually named. So this disease is something that we have been officially been dealing with for over 120 years now. Really, diagnosis has been evolving over many years. The diagnosis has been a primary clinical diagnosis. Just in the past 20, 30 years have we added additional biomarkers or markers of the disease that have really accelerated our ability to treat the disease. So we can skip from 1910 all the way to 1974 when the National Institute of Aging was founded, and real initiatives were made at the federal level to try to develop new therapies for this disease. In 1976, Alzheimer's was recognized as the most common form of dementia, and it was only in 1984 that the beta amyloid plaques in the protein beta amyloid was identified. In 1984, the National Institute of Aging funded a network of Alzheimer's disease centers, of which we are part of one here at the Penn Memory Center. The tau protein, the other protein that we see in Alzheimer's disease, which deposits in tangles, was identified in 1986. The first trials for Alzheimer's disease therapies were in 1987. In 1993 was the first medication. So really, we're only talking about the last 30 years that we've had any medications for the treatment of this disease. We identified some genes in the late 80s and early 90s, the Alzheimer's, the APP gene and the ApoE gene, which many of you are aware of, was a risk factor gene for the development of Alzheimer's. And then in the 2000s, we started to develop some additional tools to identify individuals or biomarkers. Pittsburgh compound B was the first imaging marker of amyloid plaques in the brain at the human level, which was developed in 2004. And then additional biomarkers are still in the works, which we'll talk about shortly. And then the last two lines, I think, is what really excites us right now. In 2021, aducanumab was approved, again, through this accelerated approval pathway, though there was significant controversy about aducanumab. Subsequently, in 2023, Lecanemab has also been approved, and we are very hopeful that lecanemab and hopefully soon donanemab, the other anti-amyloid therapy that we're going to talk about today, will change how we manage the disease. So this disease process really isn't a single entity, meaning we always, when I see patients and I mention the word Alzheimer's disease, people have this certain picture that goes to their mind. And if any of you are my patients or have seen me in clinic, you'll have heard this spiel already. When you hear Alzheimer's disease, there's this picture that goes to your mind, and that really is of severe dementia. People who are significantly debilitated, lying in bed, unable to do anything. The reality is Alzheimer's disease is a spectrum and a continuum. It starts likely years before people even have clinical symptoms. So it starts with sort of preclinical Alzheimer's disease, which is being identified with the use of biomarkers or tools, looking for these proteins that end up in the brain, which start to cause changes years before people have symptoms. As those proteins build up, people start to develop mild symptoms, and they end up resulting in a disorder called mild cognitive impairment, which is a stage in which people have mild memory difficulties which aren't interfering or impacting their day-to-day life. Those individuals go on to progress, because this is a progressive illness, to develop Alzheimer's dementia from mild to moderate to severe over time. So how did we get to the point of developing new therapies? The first step is identifying the individuals who have the disease. So 20 years ago, 20 years ago, I'm aging myself here, is when I started medical school. So back 20 years ago, we really didn't have effective tools to identify individuals with the disease specifically, meaning we do clinical diagnoses, and clinical diagnoses can be very good. But there are individuals who may have symptoms of dementia, but they may not have Alzheimer's disease. So what has happened in the past 20 years is that a number of different biomarkers or tools have been developed to allow us to identify these individuals. And all of this work is thanks to you. So almost every trial that we do imaging, we do MRIs, some do spinal taps or lumbar punctures, we do PET imaging, and only because of your participation have we been able to develop these tools and these biomarkers. So here on the right are early pictures of that first amyloid detecting compound, Pittsburgh compound B, and we could very clearly see individuals who have amyloid in their brain here on the left versus people who don't. So this really was sort of the first time we were able to identify those individuals specifically using these tools. Subsequently, we've developed additional tools. The Pittsburgh compound B was a difficult imaging tool to utilize, so a different marker for beta peer was developed, again, partly based on the work from Chris Clark and others here in Penn. And that became sort of the first FDA-approved imaging marker for amyloid that has been clinically utilized. So what's next? So it's great to be able to do MRIs and PET scans, but wouldn't it be great if we could do something a little easier? So what is in the offing is really utilization of blood-based biomarkers. So people can go to get a blood test, and based on the blood test, we can identify if people have elevated amyloid. In addition, tau is the other marker of Alzheimer's disease, and we're developing biomarkers for both. That will allow us to identify people a lot sooner, a lot easier, and will really help us kind of make those next advances in our field. So in terms of therapies, because of all of this work, because of everything that you have done, we've finally gotten to the point where we may have effective therapies to slow down progression of the disease pathology of Alzheimer's disease. And I want a round of applause for all of you for everything that you've done here. So the two therapies we've mentioned today, the one on the left is lecanemab, which is this antibody which is infused every 2 weeks in individuals. In the clinical trials, it seemed to show a 27% slowing in cognitive decline over the 18 months of the study. That medicine was approved through this accelerated approval pathway in January, and it likely will go to the FDA for full approval later this summer. Donanemab is another medicine that you may have heard about. Very recently, the clinical trial results of this anti-amyloid antibody came out. The results were similar in that it seemed to show sort of a 30 to 40% slowing of cognitive decline. So these are very exciting times that we really may have new therapies. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit because I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing now here at the Memory Center, because we do have a number of trials, and I do want to highlight a few of them. First of all, we can't do anything without talking about the ABC study, our Aging Brain Cohort Study, which is really the major clinical trial that we're doing here. So first of all, I did want to, and again, this is voluntary, ask if anyone here is involved as a participant or a caregiver for the ABC study. Please raise your hands. So the ABC study is an observational study. People who are normal, who have mild cognitive impairment or dementia are enrolled in the study. They come in regularly for cognitive testing as well as imaging. And this really is what kind of drives our center and allows us to collect information, biomarkers, and data to really look longitudinally to see what happens over time. Can we find risk factors or things that may increase the risk of development of further symptoms? And only by having this large data set are we allowed to do this. In addition, recently the ABCD squared study was started, which is an initiative to try to help improve diversity in our patient population. So what has happened in clinical research over the past many years is that the population that gets enrolled in clinical research doesn't really match the population who have the disease. So again, one of the major initiatives in our center, as well as many centers across the country in our field, has been to try to increase that diversity and allow us to accurately represent the patient population. So the ABCD squared study is similar to ABC, and many people are co-enrolled in the ABC study. Anyone here involved in ABCD squared? Please raise your hands. The Diverse VCID study is, again, an additional ABC suite study, and many people are also enrolled in ABC here. It's looking at vascular cognitive impairment and dementia. We know that many people with Alzheimer's disease also have vascular disease in their brain, and trying to understand exactly what the overlap is and the disease progression in the real world. Nobody follows a textbook. Like, people don't just have one thing happening to them. And it's important for us to learn more information about these individuals. Anyone here in Diverse VCID? We need more people. So if you're interested, we're always looking for more people to join us. A few other studies I'm going to highlight. So the LEAD study is the longitudinal study for early onset Alzheimer's disease. And again, before LEADS, honestly, if people were younger than the age of 65 and had Alzheimer's disease, we didn't really have anything in terms of clinical research studies to offer them. The LEAD study allows us to help identify those individuals and follow them because, again, people with early onset disease may not have the exact same timeline and progression as people with later onset disease. So we are continuing to enroll individuals in LEADS. Anyone here want to raise their hands involved in LEADS? Few other studies that are enrolling. So the mismatch study is another longitudinal study looking at the relationship between these amyloid and tau proteins and neurodegeneration. Allows us to get amyloid and tau scans and MRIs in individuals. Anyone here in mismatch? So again, another study. We just started, but again, we'll continue to enroll in that. So we'll skip gears a little bit and talk about treatment trials. So again, the major treatment trial that we are currently enrolling for is the AHEAD study. The AHEAD study is a study of that medicine lecanemab, which was recently, again, approved earlier this year. So this is an anti-amyloid antibody, and the hope is by identifying individuals who are cognitively normal, who already have elevated amyloid. If we can give them a medicine to try to get rid of that amyloid, maybe we could slow down the disease. Again, the lecanemab has been studied in people with mild dementia, but this is really looking at people who are in that preclinical stage where they are still cognitively normal. Is there anyone here in AHEAD currently? Thank you. So I'll just mention one upcoming study. The ADNI study has been going on for really 30-ish years. So this is the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative. Again, it's gone through ADNI 1, ADNI 2, ADNI 3, ADNI Go. So this is now ADNI 4. So this is another sort of large-scale longitudinal study in which we are bringing people in who are at various stages of cognitive impairment and following them over time and getting all sorts of biomarkers. All of these studies are getting imaging and oftentimes blood-based biomarkers, and only by participation in these studies are we going to advance the field. So I'll finish up by just talking about a few of the challenges that we have. Again, I talked about the first one, which is diversity. We really need to have a more representative population in our studies, and we're working hard to try to improve that. Again, we'd love your input and your advice, participation in advisory boards, and anything you can do to help us in terms of improving our research. We also need to have better designs of our studies. How can we make our studies easier for our subjects? How to make it more patient-centric? What are the things that are blocking individuals from joining our studies, and how can we improve on that? And the last is, how do we balance clinical care with recruitment into trials? Again, that's not a problem that we've had in the past. So I think it's a good problem to have. But at the same time, we will need to balance because, again, we still need to make advances in our field. We still need to recruit people into research. Some people will be taking these new medications, and how do we design our studies to balance that? And last of all, I just want to thank you. Clinical research to develop new therapies cannot happen without your participation and your help and support in all of our research studies. We cannot do this without you. So I just want everybody to get a round of applause. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Felicia Greenfield, and I'm the executive director of the Penn Memory Center. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and together, along with Allison Lynn, who is, I think, out at the registration table, we wanted to share some of the programs that we have available for free to everyone who's affiliated with the Penn Memory Center, including all of you in this room. So in case you didn't know about things that we have to offer for you, I just want to share some of the programs that are available. So we have a team of social workers, and what we do is, for you all, is we provide personalized education and coaching for the entire family. So when folks come into our center to have a workup, an evaluation, and receive a diagnosis, they have an opportunity to meet with a member of our team to kind of talk about where you are in your journey and really kind of personalize a plan, a tailored plan for you moving forward. We do this through community-based referrals. We share information about resources that are available in the community, as well as resources that are available to you right here through us at our center. We have a variety of programs that I'm going to share with you in just a minute. The programs are social. We want to encourage opportunities for social connections with one another. We have a couple mentorship programs that I'll talk to you about, and a respite program available as well. And another one of our goals is to train the next generation of dementia-specialized social workers. So when people are coming in to our center, when they're making an appointment, we send out a new patient packet and we ask for information. And we also ask for information from family members, usually the primary person who is responsible for caring for the person with dementia. And we ask if they'd like to meet with a social worker, and if so, what would be helpful to them. And this is a quote that I'll read to you from one of the caregivers who submitted information to us. "I can't express how difficult the role of primary caregiver is for my mother, for me, how difficult it is for me to care for my mother. My brother and his wife are very supportive and give me weekly breaks, but I'm still overwhelmed. The memory loss causes repetitive questions, ungratefulness, and a contrary attitude that is stressful to the extreme. The physical care, fortunately, is the easy part and not drudgery. Childhood resentment is also a problem for me. A better understanding of dementia would probably be helpful." So we recognize that getting a dementia diagnosis is kind of a life-changing, or can be a life-changing diagnosis, not just for the individual, but for the entire family. And we want to help people by providing information and education. And we want to do this so that people can live more fully and meaningfully and with dignity. We want to help minimize negative effects of social isolation. We've been hearing a lot in the media lately about the negative effects of social isolation, and I think that social isolation can be intensified for families living with dementia. We also understand the importance of caregiver well-being. We know all too well that oftentimes caregivers put their own self-care on the back burner to care for the patient, and we want to help caregivers recognize the importance of taking the time to care for themselves and provide opportunities for them to do that. So one way we do that is through offering programs, which Dr. Karlawish mentioned earlier, are all free. Most are free of charge to you. I'll talk about the one where there is a low cost associated with it. But one program that we have, probably our cornerstone program, is Caring for the Caregiver. It's a class, it's a 7-week class available to people new to the caregiving journey. We teach very practical tools and strategies for caregiving. In caring for the caregiver. So, and I'll also tell you how to access all of these programs at the end of my presentation as well. So if you're interested, I'll show you who to reach out to. In addition to the class, we have support groups. We have a variety of support groups for caregivers, as well as former caregivers. So we offer grief groups as well. We have community partners, and one of them is the Curtis Institute. And the folks at Curtis Institute, which is it's a music conservatory for musical students. And we partner with Curtis in order to bring music to our patients and caregivers. So what this picture is it's some Curtis students and some of our patients together at the Curtis Institute, and they're making music together. So it's a fun, engaging, and powerful program that's available to you for free. Memory cafes. We hold these monthly. They are currently being held. Ralston House is under renovation. As you may know, the parking lot is no longer available. We used to hold the memory cafes in the Ralston Center. We are doing them now at Christ Church Neighborhood House in Old City until Ralston House is ready again. At the memory cafes, we have in the morning, we have coffee and pastries, and we offer some form of entertainment, whether it's music or performance or comedy or dance. So they are fun and monthly and free. Cognitive Comedy is a program that is delivered through a woman named Jean, and I'm forgetting her last name. And Jean is a professional improv coach, And she teaches folks just the kind of skills of yes and improvisational comedy, and it's a lot of fun. And if you've taken any of Jean's classes, I think you'll say that there's a lot of laughs and camaraderie that happens as a part of that group. We offer monthly grief yoga. Beth Segaloff is a licensed clinical social worker in Connecticut who offers Zoom yoga for anyone who's experiencing feelings of grief or loss. They don't require a lot of movement. You don't have to be able to, sit in lotus for a long period of time. It's just, there's a lot of breath work and a lot of expression that can release some of the feelings of grief. Time Together is one of our newest programs, and this is a respite/mentorship program. So we train students, college students, to provide respite care, or to provide respite care, and to give caregivers a break, and while doing so, allow the person living with dementia an opportunity to share their life experience with the students. So we try to match students and families where there's a common interest in order to allow for meaningful interaction and engagement. So this is a program, Time Together is our in-person version. So we are sending, just as of March, we started sending students back into the homes of families. Weekly Smile is our virtual program. So if you live too far away where there are no students in your area, you can access virtual programming through Time Together, or Weekly Smile, sorry. There is a low cost for the Time Together program. We pay the students $10 an hour, and we do that by billing the families $10 an hour, and that whole payment flows through us, and the students get a paycheck. So that's, if you were to get somebody from the community, from an agency to come in, you're looking at, $23 an hour. So it's significantly reduced cost. And we do have a sliding scale for that program if you're interested. And then our newest program that we are just in the process of launching is called the Caring Collective. And this is a mentor-mentee program for caregivers. So we match people who are newer to the caregiving journey with veteran caregivers who can provide, additional insight and support to a newer caregiver. Another one of our programmatic offerings is called Empowering Caregivers, and this is a monthly lecture series. So we contract with a variety of different professionals in the community to deliver meaningful talks to you all. And these are a couple of talks that we just had recently. One was with Lainey Dratch, a conversation with a genetic counselor. And then we had Dr. Regina Kopp talking about dementia and sexual expression. So if you're interested in this lecture series, you can find out more information online, and all you have to do is register. And they're all via Zoom right now. We have a training mission. We just launched for these 4 folks. They were interns with us for the year. They started in September, and they just finished at the end of April. Susan Whitcomb, she was a second year advanced clinical student from Penn School of Social Work, who completed her internship and is now going back to Boston, where she is from, to find work there. John McCain was with us this year as well. Carly Rogers was a first-year student, and she's remaining with us over the summer. And then Rachel Marks was a student who just finished her internship, a second-year student, and we are retaining her for a year through a new program, which is our Clinical Social Work Fellowship program. And so what Rachel is going to be able to provide to folks for the year is free psychotherapy. So we're offering 6 to 8 weeks of psychotherapy through Rachel for anyone who is trying to cope with changes or caregiving, anything related to the work we do at the center. So we're really excited to have that option for you all as well. Our full-time team consists of Allison Lynn and me. We direct the program, and then Leah Fine, who is out at the registration table, is our Associate Director for Social Work, and Meg Kalafsky is our Associate Director for Social Programs. So Leah's in the clinic, and Meg is behind the scenes running all of the programs. As we mentioned, this is all available to you free of charge, and our work is made possible through philanthropy and grants. Primarily, the Julius H. Kaplan Charity Foundation established the Caring Difference Fund in 2016, and people subsequently can donate to that fund to help us keep delivering these programs for you. Community Care Corps and the Oasis Foundation is a grant that is supporting our Time Together program. So just thank you. And if you are interested in learning more about any programs or enrolling in any of our programs or groups, Meg Kalafsky is your contact. And you have, can we hold up that brochure for me? There are brochures like that that have a synopsis of these programs, and Meg's information is on the back. So if you are interested, just reach out to Meg. Thank you very much.
Just right arrow or click through.
Hi, everyone. I first just want to say I can't say enough how lucky we are to have the program that Felicia and her team has developed with regard to providing additional care and support for patients and families. And it really is unique to the Penn Memory Center that we offer those kinds of services. I think if you are seen in other locations, mostly because of financial constraints, there's not that kind of support and programming. And so, and I think they've done an incredible job of creatively developing these programs. So very grateful as a clinician to have their support. I'm Dave Wolk. For those of you who don't know me, I co-direct the Memory Center with Jason. We've been doing this team for a while now. And I also direct the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. So it is incredibly gratifying and actually humbling to see so many of you here today. I mean, it's amazing that we have this kind of a turnout. And while there's a long road ahead for us within studying and treating and caring for patients with Alzheimer's disease and other conditions like it, I do hope that you all at least feel some connection to the idea that I think we are entering a new era in this disease. And my hope is that this is going to be very much like the beginning days of where cancer started to get a real foothold on treatments, where now there's an explosion of therapies in that field that's really targeted towards individuals and their individual diseases. And so while, again, I think we acknowledge, and I think it's important to know that there's a tremendous amount of work ahead, this, to me, is a real inflection point in the field. And so that's why I entitled this A New Era. I could have entitled it A New Hope, but then I feel like there'd be copyright issues with the Lucasfilms people. So, Sanjeev did a wonderful job on touching on some of these. I'll sort of reinforce or amplify some of the things that he talked about earlier. But I think over the last 5 years or so, there have been several things that are really kind of earth-shifting within our field. One is, and this has been known for a while, but I think somewhat simplified, in that there really is a recognition and truly now an embrace of the idea that Alzheimer's disease is a heterogeneous condition. I think in the past we've thought of it as a more kind of monolithic, unified type of process, and it limits our ability to treat the disease because there's lots of different biology and factors that go into Alzheimer's disease. And I think the field has accepted this fact about the disease. It makes it more complicated, but it also allows us to develop tools to better treat it. Another, I think, major change, and we'll talk about in a little bit, is that how we even diagnose the disease, at least in a research setting, and I definitely think within clinical practice in the very, very near future, we're starting to define the disease based on its biology rather than what a clinician says about someone's likely underlying diagnosis. As Sanjeev mentioned earlier, another major thing, something that I can't tell you all how skeptical we all were as a field that we would ever have blood tests for Alzheimer's disease. Several years ago, it was unheard of to think about it. There have been lots of attempts, but to get measures from proteins in the brain into your blood that you can detect is, I think, an amazing accomplishment within the field and will change not only how we treat the disease here, but it has implications for our ability to treat the disease across the world. Because a lot of the things that we talk about that we do in research and starting to emerge in practice here in this country are just not things that are accessible to other countries and certainly to other areas of the country outside of big cities like our own. Another advance that, again, Sanjeev talked about, I'll talk a little bit more, is while these drugs are imperfect by absolutely any measure, they do seem to be slowing down the course of Alzheimer's disease. We do seem to actually be able to change the biology of the disease. And that, again, I can't tell you, I've been doing this a little bit longer than Sanjeev, although not that much longer. He just looks a lot younger than me. The thought of a drug that really is targeting the biology of the disease and has an effect on patients' lives is something that, again, we've been working on for over 20 years with very little, with many successes in the laboratory, but never any successes in patients until recently. And so that's, I think, an incredible change. And I think all of this together brings together an era of precision medicine. And what that really means is where we target therapies and drugs that are tailored to individual patients based on understanding their biology, all the factors that go into why they have the symptoms that they do. And I think we will start to integrate that into our practices again in the very near future. And I think I've talked about this several years ago, maybe at the last time we all met together, and there it was more of a pipe dream. Now I think it's a reality that we're heading into. So I do always like to tell people who we are, because I think there's always a little bit of confusion what the Penn Memory Center is, what the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center is. And on some level, that probably doesn't matter all that much, but I think it can be confusing to people. But our Memory Center really is a center that is focused around clinical care, so it's where we see patients. It engages in clinical research, and then it really is involved in education and training, education of the community, but also training of new clinicians, as Felicia mentioned earlier, within the social work sphere, but certainly within neuropsychology and within neurology and geriatrics. And the reality is we have such a small number of clinicians for a condition that is a major, major public health issue. And so it would be wrong of us not to make training a major aspect of what we do, because we just don't have enough clinicians to take care of patients. And it's why you all who've tried to get appointments with us have the pleasure of hearing about 6-month wait times or longer. The Alzheimer's Center is actually a National Institutes of Health funded center that really is to serve as the nidus or the center of Alzheimer's disease research at Penn. And it's very closely integrated with the Penn Memory Center, particularly with regard to all the aspects of patient-facing work. But there's lots of other work that goes on in the Alzheimer's Disease Center in laboratories and in other areas of research that you might not see, but that are working diligently with materials and data and blood and spinal fluid and imaging that we get from all of you who participate in our studies. I just put this in because I just like pictures of myself and figured it would make me feel good to be able to show another image of myself. So the team, we've already mentioned Jason, and Felicia serves as our executive director. Actually, I think I put this in because PowerPoint made this slide for me automatically, and I was like, that's kind of cool. I like those. So. Our clinical core of the Alzheimer's Center, but also the Memory Center, really involves a number of physicians, and we've grown dramatically. I think when Jason and I and Felicia were doing this 7 or 8 years ago, there were 3 clinicians and 1 social worker, which was Felicia, and now it's grown dramatically over the years. We have 8 or 9 clinicians. We're continuing to get more clinicians who are coming through our training program, and we like to keep people who come through our training program, which Sanjeev has led for a number of years. And so the hope is we will continue to grow to be able to meet the demands of our patients. Just to give you also an idea of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, this is our there's more pictures of me. See, there's me again. The Alzheimer's Center involves actually leadership in a variety of disciplines here at Penn. And so it includes the clinical core, which I, with Dawn Mechanic-Hamilton, lead, and it includes outreach engagement core, which Jason leads with Emily Largent. But there's also other cores that are involved in genomic studies, in blood biofluid biomarkers, in neuroimaging, in data management and informatics, AI type of work. And so there's a lot going on at the center, again, that I think all of you probably don't realize how much your data and information you're providing to us is really pushing the field forward, and all these individuals' work is dependent on your participation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these sort of changes that have occurred in the field, and I've given this slide before, but I just, for emphasis, Alzheimer's disease is heterogeneous. I think everyone in the room could agree about this if you've talked to other families that are dealing with it. It's heterogeneous in age of onset. Usually we think of people in their 70s and 80s with this condition. We see people in their 40s and 50s with this condition. The rate of progression is very variable. Some people, will be 16, 17 years and you'll see very slow change. Other people in just a couple years will have really significant change in their thinking. The pattern of the pathology in the disease, which we'll talk a little bit about, also is different. Some people, memory areas of the brain are most affected. That's what we think about with Alzheimer's. Sometimes it's visual spatial areas, though. Sometimes it's language areas. And so that's heterogeneous. Why is that heterogeneous? Hard to know. There are co-pathologies that go on in Alzheimer's disease that, again, is something we as a field have been really learning a lot about in recent years, and Penn has really led the way in this. So vascular disease often is combined with Alzheimer's disease, but there are other degenerative conditions that can co-occur. Other medical conditions influence it. The cognitive and behavioral symptoms are different because of all these differences between individuals. So again, someone might have more memory problems. Someone might have more behavioral problems. They might have more agitation or hallucinations or depression. And so that can vary across people. And then I think importantly, and this is something I think we can leverage, is there are differences in how resilient or vulnerable people are to the disease. The same amount of Alzheimer's disease in 2 people can look very, very different. Some people can tolerate a lot more of it before even having symptoms, and other people are very vulnerable to it. And so we need to learn why that's the case so that we can better enhance people's resilience to it, so you can live longer even if you develop some of the pathology without having the symptoms affect you as much. And I think really related to that, and this is something we study quite a bit here, are what we call social and structural determinants of health, things like education, stress, access to health care. And these are things that may influence in particular why underrepresented groups in research often deal more with these kinds of medical conditions, and in particular with Alzheimer's disease. And so I put this in. This is from work we did and published a few years ago. Not to confuse you all, but these are called spaghetti plots, and not having eaten yet, they're making me hungry, I think, a little bit. But basically, what each of these lines are individuals and their trajectory on a cognitive measure over time in people with what we call preclinical Alzheimer's disease, where they have evidence of amyloid in their brain, but they don't yet have symptoms, and then people with mild cognitive impairment. And if you look at their trajectory over time, going down is worse. And a lot of people do go down, and overall the dotted lines are the average, and they slightly go down. But there's incredible noise. Some people get a little better, some people get a little worse. It's just a very noisy condition over time, and the testing itself is relatively noisy as well. But again, I think this marks the heterogeneity. There are some people who have dramatic declines over just, this is a 2-year time frame, and others, again, that don't change at all, or even, sort of do a little bit better on our tests. And so one of the things we've worked on is, are there better biological markers we can use that track the disease as opposed to these kind of cognitive tests? And so we've been measuring the very earliest parts of the brain that are affected by Alzheimer's with MRI scans. This is the part of your brain involved in memory, and we at really fine levels can measure it. And if we do, we really improve. That dotted line now has a bit more of a downward trajectory, so we're better tracking the disease over time. But I think the bigger point is, even with this biological measure of brain shrinkage over time, which now most cases go down, they go down at very different rates in people. Some people it's really fast, and some people it's much, much, much slower. And so heterogeneity is very much a part of this disease. Even in a group that we really selected, you're very mild and you have Alzheimer's disease, even with that very selected group, there's an incredible amount of heterogeneity. The one thing I'll point out, though, is these kinds of measures have influence on how we do trials. So if you use that cognitive measure, it would take about 1,700 people to do a trial to show a 25 to 50% effect of a drug, whereas if we use our imaging measure, you could do the trial with 114 people. And so that kind of thing actually helps speed along the field and for us to develop better therapies. Another source of variability is likely genetics. And as Sanjeev mentioned, there used to be these sort of 3 genes that were associated with what's called an autosomal dominant form of the disease, which is very, very rare. But then there was this one risk gene called apolipoprotein E that many of you have probably heard about that increases your risk of the disease. And that was it. And then over the last 10 to 15 years, really the last 10 years, many genes have been discovered and many genetic risk factors have been discovered. Almost 80 genetic risk factors have been discovered in the last 5 or 6 years. And I will say a lot of that work comes from Penn. So a lot of that work comes from genetics that all of you, or those of you who provide that for us, go to, but also Penn is the center site of what's called the National Institute on Aging's Genetic Consortium. And Lisan Wang and Jerry Schellenberg, who are in our ADRC, lead that across the nation. And so we've really, Penn played a big role in the genetics. The bottom line is, though, that knowing the genetics more, and many of these genes, they give you a little bit more risk, of getting it, or if you don't have it, a little less risk. So they it's more how they add up together than any individual one. But they also help us understand targets for the disease. So the genes are telling us that they're associated with things like inflammation in the brain, so microglia, which are the inflammatory cells in the brain. A lot of the genes are linked to that. Another area they're linked to is lipid metabolism. And so cholesterol and other aspects of lipid function are important. And so by knowing the vast genetics of this disease, and it's going to be heterogeneous, some people are going to have more of one type and more of the other type, we're starting to learn the biology of the disease and becoming better able to treat it. One other, I think, really important thing, and this gets a little complicated, so I'll try to make it simple, is Alzheimer's disease occurs in a person who's lived a life. And our brains age. And our brains actually age at different rates, and there are different changes that occur to our brain, just like aspects of our muscle strength and our joint strength changes. Our brains change sort of dissociated from Alzheimer's disease, just part of normal brain aging. And actually, remarkably, using, and this is from work that we did, using machine learning, or AI, one can actually predict someone's age, kind of like the old carnival people used to do, with a brain scan within about 5 years of what your actual age is. And so we can say, you look like a 70-year-old brain, you look like a 65-year-old brain, and do that pretty accurately. However, we're not always 100% accurate. So there are some people who look like their brain looks older than they actually are. And there's some people who their brains look younger than they actually are. And it turns out we can separate that brain age effect from the effect of Alzheimer's. And when we do that, we see that they both contribute to cognitive problems. So in other words, if you had a healthier brain with the same amount of Alzheimer's disease, or your brain ages better, you'll actually have less symptoms, whereas someone whose brain is aging faster will have more symptoms with a given level. So why is that important? Because there are probably a lot of lifestyle factors and other things that go into resilient brain aging and might allow one to have less symptoms of the disease. And in fact, there now is a lot of data about lifestyle factors that reduce your risk of the disease, probably by making your brain more resilient. And it turns out in a number of studies that about 40-50% of the risk of Alzheimer's, not genetics, is related to these lifestyle factors, things like exercise, eating well, lipids and vascular risk factors, education, a variety of those kinds of things, obesity. Those factors do increase your risk of, I think, less resilient brain aging, and then therefore more likely to develop symptoms of Alzheimer's disease earlier, again, for a given level of Alzheimer's. So these, I think, this slide can be actually kind of comforting in that there are things we can do to make our brains as resilient as possible to this condition. One thing, again, that I think has become really evident and something that we're really pursuing is it does turn out that different groups, particularly groups that are less well represented in research, as Sanjeev mentioned earlier, seem to have higher rates of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And this includes the African American or Black community, and this includes the Hispanic or Latinx community as well. And they both show about a doubling or a 1.5 rate of developing dementia. And so why is that the case? And we believe, and there's, I think, more and more data to support this, and this gets back into that brain aging and resilient brain aging, that a lot of this has to do with things like social and structural determinants of health, which are the challenges and opportunities people have, access to health care, other life stressors that influence how your brain ages, and that those things are, again, important things for us to learn about so we can intervene earlier with, not just, I think, on an individual level, but even on a policy level to push forward. And that's why many of you in this room have been getting these requests to fill out information about social and structural determinants of health, things like where your neighborhood environment, your early childhood experiences, education, life stressors, socioeconomic status. And this actually just graphically shows what we ask people about. We ask people about childhood adversity, discrimination, health literacy, et cetera. And we're really trying to learn the degree to which these different factors influence how people do with this condition. And I think it's really important work, again, for helping us to move the field forward and more equitably take care of our patients. Our ADRC, as you know, is very committed to improving representation in aging and AD research. And as Sanjeev said earlier, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, that's the one with the ADNI 1, ADNI 2, ADNI 3, ADNI 4, ADNI Go. It's like Rocky and Creed at this point, that it's like so many sequels. The last Creed was really good, by the way, if anyone saw that. Really enjoyed that. those studies had incredibly poor representation of Black participants, only about 5%. And so much of what we know about biomarkers has come from that study, and that's a problem. And so we're trying to address that in part through the Aging Brain Cohort dedicated to diversity. I think I would say that this is not something we're doing alone. This is a national effort, and the NIH is very, very much engaged in this as well. And so I think it's hopefully a changing time in that regard. And in reality, it's more than just even understanding the disease in people across different groups. It's also just an equity issue. Everyone should be, involved in research if they want to be. Moving back to other aspects of heterogeneity in the disease, one of the things that's been really discovered over recent years, again, I think we knew this for years, but we kind of didn't accept it, was that Alzheimer's disease is often associated with more than one pathology. And so this is from the Rush University data set, and these are people who clinically got a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, and then this was their pathology. So these are people who donated their brains for research. The non-blue groups here all represent misdiagnosis, where they were told they had Alzheimer's disease, but they turned out to have a different degenerative condition or vascular disease. And so it was about 20% of the people. And if you look across studies, it's about 20 to 30% of people are mislabeled as Alzheimer's when they have a different degenerative condition. It's not because the clinicians are bad, it's just because it's really hard to diagnose the disease purely in a clinical manner based on paper and pencil tests in individuals. So that's one issue. The other is if you look across the blues, those are all people who they did indeed have Alzheimer's disease. Most of them had Alzheimer's disease with vascular disease or Alzheimer's disease with another degenerative condition. And in fact, the majority of them had both vascular disease and other degenerative conditions in addition to Alzheimer's. And the smallest group with Alzheimer's disease was people with just Alzheimer's disease. So the least common form of Alzheimer's disease is Alzheimer's disease alone, just a sliver. We here, so people who participate in the ABC study and other studies here who are willing to donate their brains, we've looked at this as well. We've actually been one of the leading sites that's sort of a champion of putting this data out there. We've seen the same thing. This doesn't include vascular disease, but only a third of our patients have, when they go to autopsy, have Alzheimer's disease as the only pathology. We see other pathologies, something called TDP-43, which is used to be thought to be associated with just frontotemporal dementia, but it turns out it's associated with this other condition called LATE, which is a terrible name for a condition because it's an acronym that I'm not even going to say because it's such a long-winded acronym, but basically something that also affects memory and thinking. And then alpha-synuclein is something that we traditionally associate with Parkinson's disease, but often co-occurs with Alzheimer's disease. And one thing I'll point out is at Penn, and this is based on autopsies and brain donation from our cohort, TDP-43, alpha-synuclein, and the tau of Alzheimer's disease were all described here at Penn through my predecessor, John Trojanowski. And so Penn has played a really key role in defining these different conditions over time, and the field would be nowhere without that definition. And it actually is a tribute to the people who are willing to donate from our community. Co-pathologies matter. They are a source of the heterogeneity we see. I mentioned earlier, you saw some people had really rapid decline in their measures and others that were really flat. Well, one of the causes is this co-pathology. So this is just one example looking at that TDP-43. When it's in people with Alzheimer's disease, the rate of atrophy in the memory area of their brain, shrinkage of that, is much faster in those with TDP-43 than those without it. And so it really influences outcomes. Again, I think we've hammered this home. The diagnosis of Alzheimer's clinically is limited. We're about right 75-80% of the time. And that incorrect diagnosis, we used to say, well, clinically it doesn't really matter because there's not a therapy and it's almost always some other degenerative condition. And so, we treat people symptomatically. It's not going to make a big difference. But one area where it really made a big difference is in clinical trials, because if 25% of the people in your trial don't have the disease you're treating, it's going to be really hard to see a treatment effect of the drug because many of the people in the treatment group aren't going to respond because they don't really have the disease. The other thing is because we're moving towards directed therapeutics, the misdiagnosis obviously then has even more implications. And again, the main pathologies of Alzheimer's are these amyloid plaques and tangles, and that really is what defines Alzheimer's. If a pathologist looks at a brain, that's what they are defining the disease as having. And as Sanjeev mentioned earlier, and this is actually a direct picture from my other predecessor, Chris Clark, who led the Penn Memory Center, this is work showing with amyloid PET that there's a very high correlation between amyloid PET imaging and the amyloid plaques of Alzheimer's disease. And there are now 4 FDA-approved tracers. They're not covered by insurance at this point, so we only get these through research. That very likely will change with some of these newer drugs that are coming out, because we need to know about people's amyloid status. And now, remarkably, there's even ways for us to measure that other protein in Alzheimer's disease, tau, with tracers. And again, the same kinds of studies were done that link what we see in a patient's brain on a scan to what we see in pathology. And so this tool is also very useful. There's one already FDA approved for this. And in fact, in the donanemab trial, they tried to find a sweet spot of how much tau there should be in the brain for treatment effects to be as efficacious. And I think there'll be other tracers approved in the near future. And so this has led to something we talk a lot about in our field, which is, should we biologically define the disease? Should we define the disease based on amyloid and tau the same way that a pathologist defines the disease based on amyloid and tau? And I think the general feeling is we should, because that's what we're trying to treat, and that's what the biology is directed at. And so that led to something called the ATN framework. Jason Karlawish was on this initial paper describing the ATN framework. And there we determine the presence of amyloid. That can be determined by amyloid PET or spinal fluid. And then we determine the presence of tau based on tau PET and another spinal fluid measure of phospho-tau. And in order for us to say someone has Alzheimer's disease, one needs to have both amyloid and tau in their brain. And then N reflects neurodegeneration. That's the downstream effects of these molecules in the brain. And that helps us with staging the disease and determining to the degree to which that's actually affecting someone. And just very briefly, one thing we've done, and I won't go into detail, is because we know tau and brain structure, that the injury to the brain in Alzheimer's is really driven by tau. One of the things we've been trying to do with imaging is to determine how much of the injury to the brain is due to Alzheimer's disease, and then what's left after, to measure how much other factors in the brain are causing people's memory or thinking issues, and also whether there are people who are resilient, who have less brain shrinkage than they should for a given level of Alzheimer's disease. And actually, we've had really great success in seeing that we have people who are vulnerable, who likely do have other co-pathologies and have a more rapid rate of decline. And then there are people who have resilience and have very little to no decline over time. Why is this important? Why would we want to bring this into practice? Well, I don't know. If we're going to treat someone with donanemab and there's a risk to it, maybe we think, if you're looking like you're not going to change a lot over the next 4 years, maybe we wait. Maybe if you're going to be more rapid, we're more aggressive about trying to treat earlier. And so these are the kinds of things that we're going to start needing to bring into practice. But as Sanjeev said earlier, blood tests have arrived too that might make things a little less expensive to do. There are blood tests for the amyloid in the brain. These are about 85-90% accurate relative to PET scans. So not perfect, but if nothing else, they incredibly speed up the time studies can be done. So if we're doing a study, again, like the AHEAD study, I think someone raised their hand, or a couple people raised their hands who's in that. If we're looking for people who have quote-unquote preclinical disease, don't yet have symptoms, instead of scanning 5,000 people, right away, one can get these blood tests in 10 or 15,000 people very quickly and find people who are likely to go on to have a positive amyloid scan. And it really shortens the time needed for a trial. And actually, it really reduces the expense of the trial as well. There are also tau measures now that Sanjeev mentioned that might be even a little better than the amyloid measures. I put this in because this is work that includes people in the ABC study. So these are controls from our ABC study, or cognitively normal individuals who are amyloid negative, and these are people with autopsy-confirmed Alzheimer's disease, and there's really big discrimination on these blood tests. They really do what they're supposed to do. And there are other newer blood tests that are coming out that even have higher accuracies, almost up to 95, 96% of detection of the disease. So these are here, and they're going to be brought into practice, no doubt about it. And then there's these trials, and I know we did our video before, and so I won't go into detail, but they're really remarkable. I think, again, imperfect, but from the sense of like moving forward in the field, I think really amazing that there are these drugs that are directed towards the amyloid in the brain and actually really truly reduce the amyloid in the brain. So this is amyloid PET using the drug lecanemab, and this is on placebo with amyloid PET, so these patients continue to have very high levels of amyloid and actually go up a little. And with lecanemab, there's an incredible reduction in amyloid in the brain, and in fact, about 70% of people by the end of the study are what we would call amyloid negative. You would get an amyloid PET scan, and you wouldn't know that they had Alzheimer's disease based on the amyloid PET scan. And we see that also affects tau in the brain, this sort of downstream effect of amyloid, the same thing where they have much lower levels as opposed to increasing. All that doesn't matter a lick if it doesn't change cognitive trajectories in people. It's a laboratory experiment until it does. And the reality is it does seem to slow down the disease modestly, though, not dramatically. Maybe, depending on the measure you use, about a 30% slowing of the disease for this drug. We don't know, these drugs have only been studied for 18 months, though, and so we don't know they've been studied longer, but the data that's come out has only been for 18 months. And so we don't know 2, 3, 4 years if those curves continue to separate, if they move together, if they cross. We don't know. And so that's what we'll have to learn clinically. The bottom line is this study, its earlier study, now the donanemab study, there are multiple studies showing this clinical effect with these drugs that are potent like this particular drug. And so I think monoclonal antibodies are going to come into our clinical practice. I think that there'll likely be FDA approval for lecanemab, full approval by July, which will then influence Medicare decision-making around coverage, which right now it's not covered. Donanemab showed, at least based on a press release, maybe even more impressive results, in part because they used precision medicine. They really defined individuals based on how severe their Alzheimer's disease was using amyloid and tau PET imaging. But they met all of their endpoints as well. That was very similar to their earlier study. They quoted that after a year, 47% of people on that drug remained stable relative to 29% on placebo. So the drugs seemed to work, and it would have actually been very disconcerting if donanemab, quite frankly, didn't work, because it would be hard to then understand why lecanemab did, and even the signal that we saw with aducanumab as well. So I think we now know that if you clear amyloid, it does affect outcomes in individuals. However, and again, I don't want to get into this in too much detail now, but we'll continue to give public lectures. There are risks and that weigh those benefits, and we're going to have really significant conversations with people about what their risk tolerance is and how they want to think about this drug. But I think we all believe that should be a discussion between us and a patient, rather than something that people don't have access to. I'll just say, and I have only 2 slides yet. I know I'm probably like 30 minutes over, so I'm sorry. But I'm so excited. We're not done, right? So these drugs maybe slow the disease down 30 or 40%. Why is it only 30 or 40%? Well, one might be that amyloid's not enough. 2, it might be those copathologies we're talking about. It might be that if you treat Alzheimer's, you're only treating Alzheimer's, and that maybe the maximum you can get isn't 100%, maybe it's 70%, 60%. Bottom line is that we're looking at other pathways, and there was recently also just extremely exciting data about trying to tackle that tau protein in the brain as well, using a genetic approach, something called antisense oligonucleotides, which is basically where you try to block mRNA, the genetic code that then produces proteins, produces tau in the brain. And using that, there was really convincing reduction of tau in the brain measured by spinal fluid, but also measured by tau PET. And so I think that's really exciting, because it might be that dual therapy with something like this and an amyloid therapy might be most effective. But even more than that, because of increases in funding and attention to this disease, as well as our successes, there are many, many trials in the pipeline, many studies. And I think maybe we benefited a little bit from some of the earlier failures with amyloid, because it really pushed the field to look at other mechanisms, things like inflammation, lipid stuff, some of the things we've talking about with genetics, just brain aging in general. And so there are just a panoply of drugs that are in various phases of trials that are directed towards different mechanisms that may actually, again, be different from one patient to another. The other thing I'll say is there still are, and we still are very much interested in, drugs that treat people who are symptomatic, because we need to think about not only just slowing down the disease, but treating some of the symptoms of the disease. And I think that sometimes gets a little lost from people like myself actually giving talks like this, that treating behavior, treating mood, all of those things are things that we are woefully limited at and need to get better at. So I think these therapies are going to require a precision medicine approach. I mentioned donanemab, which required a particular level on your tau PET that showed an effect. There almost certainly is going to be people who respond well to these drugs, and there are going to be people who don't respond well to them. There might be people who respond super well to them, and I think it's incumbent on us as a research center to study that, because ultimately we want to learn who's going to best benefit from this drug, who's not going to benefit, and that will help with risk-benefit analyses. And so we are, as a center, and I think the Alzheimer's Disease Center program across the country is very committed to learning that. And we're going to have to integrate, I think, a little bit more how we do clinical practice with research, and actually learn from all of you as we treat patients or as you participate in our research studies. And my hope is that, and there's actually some literature on this, that within medicine there's this cascade effect where when new therapies come out, it accelerates additional therapies down the future. And that was probably most actually strongly seen within HIV with the very initial therapies. AZT was not actually a highly effective drug, but it really spurred on a number of other drugs, and then combination therapy became used, and actually it's really changed that disease's course for individuals, and incredibly, it's one of the great accomplishments of medicine over the last 40 years. So this is why we at the ADRC, in the ABC study, D squared, LEADS, et cetera, why we study all of you who participate so much, is that we want a precision medicine approach where we collect genomic data, comorbidities, social and structural determinants of health. We try to link this to what we're seeing in the brain, and the only way we can see things in the brain while people are living is through, I always offer this, if anyone wants to give us a piece of their brain, there's a sign-up list in the back for that right now. We measure that through all of the imaging and tests we do. And so while we ask a lot of all of you, that having all of that data in individuals actually really helps us link together the biology of the disease, and I think is what's needed moving forward. So with that, I will end, and thank you all for your attention, and thank you all for being wonderful partners with us.